it seems like a year ago, but it was about 2 weeks ago, when the Supreme Court looked at Sackett v. EPA. And I will say, like, we're going to talk about two cases where the worst possible case scenario wasn't quite achieved, but it feels like it's building towards that. But let's talk about this. What was the Sackett v. EPA about?
Yeah, so this was the culmination of a decades-long fight by industry to gut a really important provision of the Clean Water Act that protects wetlands. So the Clean Water Act has a provision that specifically says it doesn't just protect large bodies of water like lakes and rivers and streams. It also protects wetlands that are adjacent to those larger bodies of water. Important word there, adjacent. And so the fight for many years has been developers trying to fill in, destroy, build on wetlands that are near a larger body of water, but not directly touching it. They are neighboring, say, a lake or a river or a stream. The EPA has generally tried to protect those wetlands because, not only does adjacent mean next to, not connecting, but they serve a really important purpose, which was the whole reason Congress added this provision. They serve a purpose of flood control. They help to purify water as it's coming into those larger rivers and streams. They help reduce sediment damage, especially as climate change increases. There are all kinds of benefits to us as people who drink and swim in water by preserving wetlands that are near the lakes and rivers that we are used to, you might say.
And they do. I mean, the point of it being adjacent is because it's for protection of those major bodies of water. I mean, in the final analysis, like they're not. I don't know that any part of the planet is disconnected from another in most respects, but they are so not disconnected as to implicate each other.
Yeah, they're intimately connected. I mean, the point of protecting wetlands in this law is not actually just to protect the ecosystem of a wetland. It is to protect the rivers and streams and lakes that are important for us as humans to be able to drink from and swim in. I could spend hours now quoting you all of these scientific studies about how when there's wetlands near a larger body of water, the water that is ultimately ends up in our systems and cities is purified. It's much higher quality. There's more protection, because nature has actually figured out how to do this and how to filter water before it gets to the urban settings and pipes that bring the water directly to our homes. And so what this case asked was basically, if a wetland is next to a large body of water, but it's not directly touching it on the surface. So there might be an underground connection and there might be a part-time seasonal connection, but if it's not constantly directly flowing into that larger body of water, so much so that it's indistinguishable, is it still protected? And by a 5-4 vote, the Supreme Court said no. And it basically said no by rewriting the law and saying, look, we understand that adjacent to does not mean connecting. Two houses in a suburb may be adjacent to each other because they are next door. They are not connected to one another. There is space between them. But the court basically said, well, if we choose that reading, we will hurt a lot of property owners' feelings. We will prevent a lot of development on wetlands that industry wants to develop. And so we are going to choose not to honor Congress's words and instead replace the word adjacent with something like continuously touching and connected to. And in doing so, probably took more than 50% of wetlands in this country outside of the scope of EPA protection in one fell swoop. And that is going to have really bad spillover effects for us, for people who need to drink water, which is every human being on the planet.
I just want to linger on that point for a second. The fact that this was codified into legislation by Congress in 1977 to make the EPA's rule on this stronger. This is exactly what the Supreme Court says they don't want to be engaged in, and yet they are undercutting it. Like the way that the right wing kind of positions itself in attacking the administrative state is like, well, then let's just put it through the legislature, right? But it did go through the legislature, and they're still being judicially activists, which I think is really key to understanding this case.
Yeah, and of all people, Justice Brett Kavanaugh made that case really well. He did not agree with the 5 justices in the majority, and he went through this history. And basically what happened is Clean Water Act is passed in the early 70s. There's a huge debate about whether wetlands are protected if they are adjacent to a larger body of water or if only if they're directly touching a large body of water. Army Corps of Engineers drafts up a regulation that says it's fine as long as they're adjacent. Congress codifies that regulation into law, into the statute we're talking about now. And almost half a century later, the Supreme Court comes along and says, and I'm really not exaggerating here, the court says, we just don't think that that's a legitimate goal of Congress. If Congress wanted to do that, it would have had to be much, much clearer, even though it's, as clear as you could possibly get in the text. And even then, we think it might lead to some kind of unconstitutional intrusion on the rights of states and landowners. And that gets to your point, Sam, at the outset, that this was bad, but not as bad as it could be. Clarence Thomas and Neil Gorsuch have this whole separate opinion where they say, well, we don't think the court goes far enough. We basically want to strike down the entire Clean Water Act because we don't think a body of water can be protected by the federal government unless it has not only a clear interstate connection, but it is used as a means of continuous transportation of goods between multiple states, and otherwise the federal government has no ability to protect it. That's what they said. The court didn't adopt that position, but maybe that's